Okay, well, welcome to episode 2 of whatever the podcast is going to be called eventually. I know that you were going to work on some intro music, right?
Yeah, I'm working on some soul.
Excellent. But I guess at some point we have to come up with
A name.
a name. But just as a reminder, we just want everyone to just be reminded once again, is to help specifically the people of Faith Church of Sellersville and Allentown Fellowship Church, the two churches that we are a part of. And as such, it's really for the average work through issues and culture that affect the church.
Yeah.
And our question we're always going to be asking and hopefully answering then is, what is the biblical response?
Yep.
That, just as a starting point, has launched us into the discussion of race and justice and that whole pool of what, quite frankly, is, and we want to kind of untie the knots, provide some clarity, and then say, okay, what is ultimately at the end of the day, how does the church respond to this issue? Like, what is the church supposed to look like in the midst of a culture right now that is unraveling? It seems like every time you turn on the news.
Statues are coming down.
Yeah, right?
Syrup is not being used.
Yeah. And so you've got people on
Some
both
people
sides.
are like, what the heck?
Yeah. Aunt Jemima, they're going after Aunt Jemima.
They're going after Aunt Jemima. I like Aunt Jemima's syrup.
And so, stuff that you look on the news and you say, okay, well, that looks like that should be happening in Venezuela.
Yeah.
But that's our own backyard.
Right.
That's happening in our cities.
Yeah.
In our state, in our national capital. And so you get people kind of on both sides, right? You got a spectrum. You've got, yes, America was founded upon, colonialism and invading lands and enslaving peoples, and there's certainly that aspect of the United States history. And our goal here isn't even to talk or even defend U.S. history. History is what it is.
Yeah, it happened, man.
It happened.
In the books.
Yep. Our goal is, or to even talk politics, because politics is what it is.
Right.
We start with the viewpoint that we live in a fallen, sin-cursed world.
Right.
And as such, you have things like racism and corrupt governments.
Yeah.
And governments and nations with stains in their history of genocide and racism and slavery and murder. There's not a nation that exists that doesn't have a history that has some dark spots in their history.
Right.
And so we look at what we're seeing on the news, and what we're experiencing now seems like it should be in another country, but as Americans, I don't think we expected this type of upheaval. And some people, like I said, some people say, no, that's what we need. We need it. It's about time. Other people are like, no, they're erasing, our heritage, and they're trying to recreate a new country, and they've tried in Seattle and things like that. So the question is not to talk about the politics of all of that. The question is what in the midst of that mess, right, a broken, sin-cursed, fallen world, what is the average Christian trying to obey God and follow the scriptures? How do they react to this? How do they live in this? How do they walk in relation to God and in relation to their neighbor in all of this? So we thought today would be, as we continue the conversation, just an opportunity to give some clarity to some terms that are out there, so that the terms that we use will be understood. Yeah. Because when you communicate, in all communication, there's you can say a term like racism or social justice, and you might get 3 or 4 different definitions for that.
Right.
So we want to come from a starting point. So I'm going to turn over to you to kind of lead this conversation today, Ron, and just kind of walk us through the terms and we'll come up with some definitions and then look at them through a biblical lens.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important too to know for those who are going to be watching or listening, we're not going to go in depth to the degree that we could.
Right.
With a lot of these terms. We could just have a whole podcast on each one of these terms. And again, the goal here is to help expose a better understanding to our listeners and viewers of, okay, so when I hear that in the news, I keep hearing this systemic racism. What are they talking about? Oh, now I see what you mean. But again, you could read dozens and dozens of pages on systemic racism.
Yep.
And then it depends on who's writing about it.
Yep.
And then even among those authors, they're going to have different slants. So our goal here is just to put out some of the terms, some of the terms that you may be hearing in the news, in the media, as our country is wrestling with racial tension, okay? And even with the list that we're talking, this is not all the terms.
Right.
I just, off the top of my head, okay, what are some of the words I'm hearing all the time? So obviously racism is a big one,
Yep.
right? Racism, and when racism is being used in the media right now, in light of what our culture is going through, it typically means black people being treated, or people of color being treated unfairly, unjustly, now this is the key, by white people. Here's the problem. Period. Okay? That's the way this term is being used. So, if you're a critical thinker and you're listening to that, a little kid is growing up listening to how the word racism is being used in the media right now, and you say, hey, what's a racist? A racist is a white person who treats a person of color or an African American or a black person or a minority wrong just because they look different. Now, my question to you, Doug, is that an accurate definition of racism?
I think if racism is defined that way, then that could be a racist definition of racism.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely it could. And it is a racist definition.
Yeah.
Because racism, the definition racism, the way it's being used today, and this is what bothers me, is it's being used as if it only pertains to white people.
Okay.
As if a black man cannot be racist. As if a Chinese man cannot be racist. As if an Indian cannot be racist.
Do you find, just from personal experience, that people in the black community do not, by and large, consider themselves racist?
Yep. I would say that, and again, and this is where another thing I'm hearing a lot in the news, which I hate, is this broad sweeping of generalization. And I don't want to be one of those guys.
Okay.
So I will speak from my context, from my sphere of influence, from my social groups growing up. If I were to ask the black people that I know if they were racist, they would say no.
Yeah. Now, on the other side, so would all the white people that I know.
So nobody's racist. So we really don't have a problem.
We must not.
This is an
Our
illusion.
cities are burning for no reason
Right,
at all.
exactly.
Right, yeah.
So maybe what religion is that says reality is not reality? Is that Buddhism? I should know this. Anyway,
Yeah, you teach it. Right?
it's really not. This is all an illusion, then, right? It's like, yeah, but most people say no, and immediately it would be flipped to, the white man is the racist, and then go into all the things, the injustices and all the things that have happened. So, biblically speaking, number one, and again, because our heartbeat is, man, let's lay over what God says over all this stuff, right?
Yep.
So biblically speaking, number one, we talk about racism. I'm fine with this definition of racism being, treating another race unjustly or differently or oppressing them because of the color of their skin. I'm fine with that. Just add to it.
Okay.
Add to it.
Now, let me just add to that just for a second.
Yeah.
A thought that I had as you were talking. You and I have both been to Africa, a couple of times.
Yep.
And you've been to Togo, which is Western Africa,
West
and I've been to
Africa,
Uganda, which is Eastern Africa.
Yeah.
But very similar. And what I noticed in African culture, like modern day African culture, was not racism in the sense of, oh, I don't like you because you're a different race. I mean, they're all Africans over there predominantly, right? And so when you go over there as a white man, you're by far minority. Right? So, yeah, in fact, in Uganda, you just be walking down the street and they'll say, "Hey, Mzungu, Mzungu," which means, "Hey, white guy." so yeah, I go to Africa and I'm automatically, pointed out by the color of my skin, right?
Right.
And we can talk about that in just identification with our ethnicity. But if you go to Africa, their issue isn't necessarily racism based on an individual's racial identity, but based on tribalism.
Right.
So they hate each other based on, some
tribe.
Based on a tribe.
Yet they have the same race or ethnicity.
Right. Do you see that as similar to, okay, I don't like you because you're of this tribe. Well, I don't like you because of you're of this race. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do you see those as kind of one and the same? Or
as far as racism, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, is that a version of racism, would you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, because see, I think the term racism is misleading in this. When you talk about, okay, so are you a racist? Am I treating you differently? Am I oppressing you because you're of a different race? Mm-hmm. I think the problem with that, biblically, there is only one race.
Right.
There's a human race.
Right.
You're a human, I'm a human.
Right, the difference between us is just the amount of melanin
in our skin. Right. So Acts 17:26, from one blood God has made all nations. That word nations mean ethnicities. Right. So race, it's a little misleading because there is only one race. I think racism should be, when a fellow human being treats another human being differently or oppresses them solely on the basis of their ethnicity. Mm-hmm. I think that's a more accurate definition of what racism is. So, but to your point, go back to Africa, well, here you have two groups that have the same ethnicity.
Right.
But now this tribe does not like this tribe.
And you've had tribes enslaving other tribes.
Absolutely. So what is that? Is that really racism? It's almost like, well, what's the basis of their differences? It's not even on their ethnicity, it's on their tribal relation.
Yeah.
So that's more of a social construct of, well, why is he doing that to him? On the basis of his social construct. Has nothing to do with him being African, he's African too.
To the point, you mentioned in the all-black college you went to, there were different fraternities.
Sororities and fraternities
that were for those that were darker black and lighter skinned black.
There you go, right. So that's what I'm saying. All these definitions, man, have so many different layers to it.
Well, and even if you go into different parts of, say Philadelphia, you've got, those that are Irish American.
There you go.
Those that are Italian American.
Right.
And they have not always got along.
Right.
So even those of European descent have had significant based on, they're both European, but no, I'm from this part of Europe, I'm from this part of Europe.
Look at some of the gangs, Southside Chicago and some of the gangs in LA, right? Back in the day when there used to be gangs in Philly. But those are blacks on blacks.
Yeah.
You from G-Town, from Brickyard.
Yeah.
Wait, we both are African American. What's the problem here? So this idea of racism, it can't just be this little small definition, because it can be on social constructs. One, there's only one human race, according to God, one nation, one blood, or many nations from one blood, Adam and Eve. What makes you and I different? Our ethnicity is what makes us different. Skin color does not make you a different human being at all. Now, again, I understand, we're not about burying our head to our American history, because at one time, African Americans, or back then as they were referred to as Negroes, were not even considered a full human being. Yep. And that was in the law book. And so I understand there's that history there, but biblically, there's only one. Yep. There's only one race. So I would change that definition.
Well, and we need to have the conversation about the whole idea of color blindness. Is that a good thing, bad thing?
Right.
Right. And we can head
that's
there
another whole podcast,
point.
Man.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's keep moving. So this other definition or phrase that you might hear, ethnocentricity. That's you'll hear that in the media. And again, it kind of goes to what we were talking about, judging somebody else based on their ethnicity, which, that happens. Or saying that, so my ethnic background, you ought to appreciate that, right? And you ought to embrace that, okay? And so this is being used right now in light of what's happening in our culture. The accusation is being put out, well, the Caucasian, the white man is saying that their ethnocentricity, like it's about their race. So blacks, you have to come up to our standard. You do, like we set the standard, right? And you have to conform to it.
So let me give you an illustration of how I think this has affected the church.
Yeah.
And I didn't see this growing up, and when I met you, it came to light. I was brought up with the teaching, basically in a nutshell, that only music that came out of classical European music was the kind of music that should be used in the church.
Right.
I was specifically taught that music that had a beat was African.
Devil
Music.
music.
And it was, that beat from Africa was the devil's music.
Bigot, Lecrae, and Mineo, and oh wow.
So different sources of information, kind of. That's kind of what I was brought up being taught with regards to music in the church. And so then you bring, African Americans into the church and say, well, that music is worldly devil music,
right?
But our European, classical
that's
music,
a great example.
That's God's music.
That's a great example.
And
that is example of ethnocentricity, right? And it's funny because I remember years ago in seminary talking to a brother about this issue of music, because I just stepped out of class. We were in a hallway in between class, the worship class, right? We took and he was making this argument that you just articulated.
Yep.
And I said to him, well, let me ask you a question. If the only music that is acceptable to God has a classical European background to it, the good old, the hymns of the faith, right? Do you realize just by default, you have wiped out every other ethnic group of music that doesn't fit that classical period of music? And he looked at me, I never forget, and he looked up at me and said, I never even realized that. Yep. I said, so there's no room for Spanish music, African music, Indian music, but classical European music circa 1400 to the 1800, that's God's music. Yeah. I said, not only do you wipe out any other ethnic race, but whatever Paul was using in the first century church, you got to throw that out too. And he began to realize how he was brought up with a ethnocentricity way of thinking that my culture is the right culture. Yep. And then we put God on top of that. Man, that's dangerous.
Yep.
That's dangerous.
Well, and I like the clarification here, judging another culture.
Another culture.
So when we talk about ethnocentricity, we are kind of talking about judging another culture, which does come from maybe race, but like I said before, your Irish culture is different than your, Italian culture or whatever, or your Dutch culture, just talking in European terms. And so when we say, no, our culture is what you have to adopt. And I've seen this on the mission field.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I saw it in Africa.
Yeah.
Funny thing. So I'm in Togo, Africa last year with good friend Honore, and we're there, and I don't speak French. They speak French. I'm sitting there waiting to preach.
Now, why do they speak French in Africa?
That's another whole podcast. That's another whole podcast. I think the French were in control for a little bit there. So I'm sitting there, and I'm listening to the French, and as they're singing, and I'm like, Honore, that's blessed assurance. And he was like, yeah, music is another issue we're working on over here. So here I am in Africa, and praise God for the missionaries that came through to Africa and proclaimed the gospel.
Absolutely.
But along with that gospel, they were this ethnocentricity. Oh, and by the way, here's the music that God will accept, and they left hymn books. Now again, I'm not against the hymns. I grew up listening to hymns, not quite sung the way you guys sing hymns, but the point is, there's a perfect example. Here we are in West Africa, and there's tension in the African church that, whoa, no, we have to keep singing these.
Yeah, these European songs.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the younger Africans are coming up saying, this is not our music.
Yeah. Yep.
So and so now we can judge one another on that,
Yeah.
and then start to determine your spirituality based on that.
We've seen it in the suburban into the urban area, like you, and music's a great illustration of
Yeah.
culture, because a lot of culture is revealed in music. We're going to bring white European style of worship into the urban culture.
Yeah.
Right. Now on the other side, you had to come out of the urban
Right.
for a time being, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And lead worship in a suburban white community,
Oh, man.
right?
Yeah. But let me speak to that because this is, as we talked about in the first podcast, our backgrounds are so different.
Yep.
And for God to bring me to faith back in 2003,
Yep.
to lead music in a German Dutch area, conservative, which again that was not my cup of tea.
Yep.
But yet we stayed here for 16 years and were able to worship God. Why? Right?
Yeah.
Because we may have different cultures, but what ultimately unites us, and we'll get to this in another podcast, is who we are in Christ.
Yeah.
It's who we are in Christ. And so,
Yeah, we didn't play one Kirk Franklin song.
we didn't
the whole
play
60
one
years.
black gospel song since. Well, there was, we would have the traveling Maranatha groups and Northland
That's
groups
all.
come in and say, now we're going to do a spiritual Negro. And I'm like, it's Negro spiritual, but that's okay. And then they would just water it down.
Yeah.
And, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. I'm like, that is not how that song goes. But again, that's another perfect example
Yeah.
of ethnocentricity. We'll do a Negro spiritual.
Yeah.
But we're going to put it through our context, take all the beat out and flatten it out. Now it's acceptable.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a form of, I wouldn't say racism, I would say prejudice.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's a good distinction, because we talk in terms of racism. We talk in terms of prejudice.
Right. Right.
How would you differentiate those? terms?
I think when we're talking racism, we're talking solely on the way I would redefine it is because there's only one race.
Mm-hmm.
If I treat you different because your ethnicity,
Okay.
right?
Yep.
Because
Yep.
you right, prejudice. We could have the same ethnicity. To your point, the two African tribes.
Yep.
But now I'm prejudiced
right.
against you because I feel my tribe, my chief, is better than yours. Now I'm prejudging you on a whole different criteria.
Yep.
So. All right, so let's keep going.
On top of that,
Okay.
this term you don't have in there, but how would you define bigotry? Because that's thrown out there a lot.
Well, bigotry is out there a lot. A lot of times when bigotry is thrown out there, it's in the context of race again, right?
Yep.
That guy's a bigot, right?
Yep.
Why? He is saying something derogatory to me, downplaying or oppressing my race or my ethnicity. So he's a bigot. I can't believe he said that. We're talking to somebody, won't say where or when, but was talking to someone and he made this comment. And they said, well, I know there's a lot going on, Ron, and I know our country got some ills, but your people have come a long way. Wouldn't you say? And this person was from an older generation.
Yep.
But the person standing there listening to this after we walked away looked at me and said, that's such a bigot. Okay, I don't know if I would go there with that particular, because I know that person. Did that person mean that? Was that bigotry? Or was that's the way that person is used to referring to colored people, your people? Was there something, maybe there was something deep down inside that person, right? Mm-hmm. So again, that's why I say some of these terms, man, they have so many different layers and nuances.
Well, and that's why, from a white person's perspective, at times we feel like we're walking on eggshells around the issue. Like, I don't want to be looked upon as a bigot or a racist. So,
Right.
what am I allowed to say?
Can I say that? Can I not say that?
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
What do I call you? Do I call you black, or do I call you African American, or do I
Yeah.
call you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so a lot of times we end up just kind of avoiding it because we don't want to get ourselves in trouble.
You don't want to get yourself in trouble and end up with a protest marching around your house, right? But this is where, okay, so what does the Bible say? The Bible says you're my brother.
Yep.
You're my brother in Christ. I affectionately call some people brother from another mother.
Yep.
Say, hey, how you doing, brother from another mother, right? But here's what's interesting. Again, as you guys can see, this topic is so, you have to walk on eggshells as a white man, as far as what you say.
Yep.
But yet within sometimes the black community, there can be derogatory terms thrown back and forth among and within that culture, and it's okay. But you can't use the same term.
Correct.
It's like, come on, people. Well, like, what's going on? Right? So you bet not call me the N-word, but yet I can call the other African American the N-word. Well, that's different, because that's a term of endearment. That
Or an
we use.
African American call the white guy the N-word. And
Absolutely.
in our culture, that's not considered racist.
Yeah, so it's like all of these different.
So is that double standard okay? Is it not
Yeah,
okay?
I think in some cases there's a double standard there.
Yeah.
Now, again, the world will, look, if the world doesn't have the point of reference of God's word, I expect all that confusion.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
But our point here is, how does the believer respond to this? Because God says what? No, you're my brother in Christ. Has nothing to do with your ethnicity. Obviously, you're a human being. There's only one race. It has to do what? Solely with what Christ did. So the wall between the Jew and the Greek has been torn down, right? There's no more enmity between us because of Christ.
And biblically, we have to talk about what that Jew-Greek
what
dynamic
that
looked like in the scriptures. Because that was the first century issue of the church.
Yep,
With
absolutely.
With consideration of race. It
Yep.
was Jew-Gentile.
Yep, absolutely.
And so, all right, moving on.
All right, so another term that we're going to hear is systemic racism. Systemic racism. What? Just understand in general, and this is a real generalized definition. Systemic racism. It means that there are policies that are in our governmental institutions right now that favor groups of people and oppress or hold back other groups of people of color, minorities. Right. That within the laws themselves and the way the laws are written, it's kind of like, you hear the deck is stacked in your favor. So you go and buy, and this is a stupid analogy, but you go buy a pack of playing cards, you get 52 cards. I go buy the same pack, I get 25. It's like, what? Well, I can only do so many games with mine. You can do more. Like, why did he get 52? That there are laws written that favor. And in the context of what you're hearing now is white America. White America is on top. Minorities are on the bottom. And the laws themselves is written that way, so there's no way you can flip that because it's already in the law books. Systemic racism. So it's something that is just going to keep happening generationally. And then So what you'll hear is people will throw stats that are real stats. Okay, look at how many black CEOs we have in our country. Look at how many black coaches we have.
Right, yep.
Look at and you can look in every area of our life, educationally, economically, politically. Where are the minorities and how do they rank in light of white America? And they're going to say the reason there's such a disparity is because of systemic racism. Okay? Now, go back to something you said starting out. Has there been racism in our country? Absolutely. What's the ultimate issue there? It's a sin issue. Okay? So, when we talk about systemic racism, is it something that does exist? Well, sure it exists. But here's something we have to keep in mind. I think God's people don't want to do this. God's people don't want to do this. They don't want to say, "Oh, come on, those were laws that were back then." It kind of feeds into the whole white privilege thing too, right?
Yep.
Because white privilege deals with, okay, you guys have all these benefits simply because you're white, and I don't. Well, that kind of comes off, well, that's the way the laws have been written for so many years that, of course, you get priority and I get, secondary, right? Okay,
Yep.
Those things are real. Those things exist in our country to a certain extent.
Yeah, 1857, Dred Scott, right?
Yeah, that's a real thing that happened.
They said the Constitution does not include citizenship for black people.
Okay, So there you go.
That's a reality.
Now,
The question is, what is the ripple effect of that?
and that's the issue right there. What's the ripple effect? And so sometimes
Because white people look at that and say,
that was way back then.
150 years
Right.
or whatever. They,
Yeah.
get over it.
And that's not the response we should have.
Okay.
For two reasons. Number one, things don't change that easily. You ever wonder why
How long ago was the Civil War?
Oh, man. That was a long time ago.
What, like 150? You know what I mean? Like mid 1800s, right? So we're not actually that. I mean, our nation is only 300.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're still considered
Still young.
a young nation
Yeah.
in comparison to a lot of nations in Europe and even things like that.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to go back too many generations before, when you think about it,
Yeah.
before you're right back at slavery.
Well, and here's the thing, Doug. Here's the thing that people need to understand. I use this analogy of the skunk, right? Because I've seen so many skunks since we moved out here. You see a skunk on the road. It's like, oh my goodness. I mean, you're coming up, first of all, you smell it.
Yep.
Then you see the carcass, then you drive on. How long does that stench last in the car? It doesn't go away just because you ran over the
Yeah.
skunk. So things that were racist laws in our country, things that in the founding of our country were racist, and yes, there were racist laws that we have. You can't deny that.
Yep.
That's history. The effect of that, even though some of those laws have been overturned, the stench of it, the ripple effect of it goes out for decades. And that's what the empirical evidence shows.
Yeah.
So, for example, why is it that most suburbs are predominantly white?
Yeah.
Why is that? People say, well, because they work hard. Well, yeah, absolutely. But there were actually laws back in the 1930s in the Federal Housing Administration that said do not give loans to, and I quote, Negroes.
Yep.
That's in the law book. So do you think that's not going to have an effect in we don't want any blacks in the suburbs. Well, there were blacks that could afford to come, but kept them out. So there were laws that were in the book where the bankers could, in good conscience, because he's not breaking the law, not allow or not give this black family a mortgage because they were considered high risk. And the underwriters said, don't you dare give it to them. And so they didn't. So what happened? You're going to end up with more whites in the suburbs than minorities. That's something that was real. It was in effect and for decades. So is that something that's not being felt now? Well, look at your suburbs.
Right. So on that, you hear, even in the black community, you hear some saying, well, we got to address our own issues. 70% of black children grow up without a father.
Yep.
Right. We don't have a race issue. We have a poverty issue. Right. And all of those statistics, those things are true. Right.
Right.
A young man growing up without a father is 10 times more likely to end up in jail or to be on drugs and whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's played out in a lot of the urban black communities. We see that. Okay. And I think the white people tend to say, like, well, you just need to have fathers in homes, and you need to have people at work, and they need to train up, and they need to and yes, that's true. But my question for you is, why is there such a poverty issue? Why is there such a absent father issue in those communities? Why? Is that one of the ripple effects of systemic racism?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay.
I believe it's one of the systemic effects or the ripple effects of systemic racism. And I'll just hit on one aspect of it, educationally.
Yep.
Okay? Educationally, you can go back, look at the history, segregation of public schools, black were in inferior schools, all of that. You can go back and look at the history of it. Okay, so if education equals economy as far as jobs, you do the math. What's going to happen? If there's subpar education, now you don't have the training. I mean, you go further back to slavery, right? Blacks are not allowed to learn to read and write. I mean, these things have ripple effects. Now, that being said, lay the biblical evaluation or commentary on this. That does not give a black person an excuse to point a gun in your face or decide to start dealing drugs because I don't have the opportunities. Here's a pushback I hear. People say, well, that was then, but now you do have the opportunities. But we're looking at a generational ripple effect of it, right? So if this guy's father and this guy's father, and not too many fathers, you don't have to go back too many generations, and you're right steeped in segregation in our country.
Well, that's my point. You don't have
Exactly.
to go back that, and you don't have to go back that many generations beyond that to
see
end
it
up even in slavery.
Exactly. So is education a ripple effect? Absolutely. Does that then equate into poverty, into fatherless homes? Absolutely, that's a player. But then biblically speaking, God doesn't look at that and say, oh, well, that's why, and therefore it justifies it. But it is an outworking. Absolutely, it's an outworking.
Okay.
So,
So you would say systemic racism is still an issue in our culture, at least?
I would say yes in this regard. The effects of it, of systemic racism,
Okay.
the ripple effects we're still feeling,
Gotcha.
right?
Yep.
And then the question becomes this: well, what about in the actual laws? Well, I'll be honest with you. I haven't looked at all the laws pertaining to housing. That housing law was no longer in effect. That was back in 1934. So in that sense, hey, that has changed. But again, look how long it was in effect, and look at the ripple effect it's had. And I think that's what we're dealing with this. There's truth here that yes, there were laws. Some of those laws have changed, right? I can go to whatever school I want to go to now, right? But for decades I couldn't, and so is it just like everything changed? Everybody's heart changed overnight because the law changed? It doesn't work that way. So there still some laws that are probably at the heart racist. We live in a sin-cursed, fallen world. Probably at some level, whether it's local, state, or federal, there are probably some laws that are probably. Can I dogmatically point to the? No, I haven't done the research.
Yeah, are there judges in certain communities that are making
Absolutely.
racist decisions from the bench? Probably.
Absolutely, right? So again, it goes back
Are there
to
cops that are acting based on
Yes.
racism? Right.
Yes. Why? Because biblically, we live in a fallen world,
Yep.
and so yeah,
So racism exists, right?
absolutely.
Systemic racism, at the very minimum, has had ripple effects on the current culture and the current
Absolutely.
Average Black American.
Yep.
And I think where the divide is in understanding between really black and white people is white people are like, wow, look how much opportunity you have in America, and that's true, right?
Now,
Yeah,
that's
right.
the key. Now,
That's right. And but those white people generally look and say,
yeah.
what are you guys complaining about?
Right.
You have opportunities now that, in this great land and
Yeah.
afforded to you that, maybe you didn't have before, but yeah, look how far we've come.
Right.
The pushback I hear on that is, I'm not willing to celebrate the victory yet because we still have a long ways to go.
Absolutely. Somebody said it this way, and it wasn't originally for me, but I thought it was a great analogy. They said it was like, okay, everybody's lined up at the starting line. Starting line of life.
Yeah.
I mean, educationally, career-wise, here we go. We're going to do life, everybody. We're in America, land of the free. All right, everybody's lined up. Black man, white man, Chinese man, everybody, right? The gun goes off. Pow! Go! Wait, Ron, not you. Oh, Mr. Chinese man, not you. Indian, well, excuse me. Hold on, wait. All minorities, please don't leave the line yet. All the white people are running. And they were held at the line for decades. And then, okay, now go. Now, you can't ignore that empirical evidence when you start looking at every area of our society. Why are minorities in the minority? They have the same opportunity. Well, hold on a minute. They might have the same opportunity now, but why is it that right now minorities are, they just don't work that hard? Really? You really believe that's why? No, it's the ripple effect of the laws that were in place for so many years. So things are different, but things aren't where they need to be.
Yeah. And so bringing it into a biblical perspective, right?
Right.
We have to talk about what is the church called to do with regards to culture. right?
Exactly.
And that may lead us next to our next terms, with regards to social justice. So let's hit on that.
Yeah. So social justice, right, is saying, listen, if we're going to have social justice, we're going to have an equal distribution of everything. opportunities, educational, employment, everything for all people, not just white America. Okay? Everybody needs an equal opportunity. This guy wants to get into Harvard Law School and he's a white guy. This black guy behind him, he wants to get in. They have the same exact opportunity. Social justice. And because there's been a disparity, because of some of the things we've been talking about, the ripple effect of laws that were in place, right now there is not a social justice in place in a lot of different areas.
Okay.
And so they're saying, this cry for social justice. In other words, let's bring the minorities up to par where the white race has been for years, and they haven't been there because of the systemic racism and the things that our country was founded on. Let's bring them up so there's social justice for all. Now the question becomes, what does that mean, and what does that look like?
Well, right? I mean, does that mean...
How do you do that?
Because what I've heard within the social justice conversation is that means we white people need to be willing to give up power or privilege or whatever.
There needs to be some type of reparations, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to the reparations discussion, or you can just go to even not even that far and just say, well, most white people like their status and their privilege and their power.
Yeah,
that's what it says, and you don't want to give that up. So therefore, you're willing to keep the black person down in order to keep what you have.
Right.
Do you think there's an element?
Oh, absolutely,
of that? Okay.
absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And so the cry for social justice is the cry for we want equal opportunity. Don't give me less of an opportunity because of my ethnicity. All right. And again, there's so many layers to social justice that we could deal with. But all right, critical race theory. Okay, and this is not something new. Back in the 80s, I think this thing came about. But basically, it's saying, look, legal institutions are inherently racist. And so this is something that is like, okay, then if that's the case.
So this is a theory that has the presupposition that the institutions in the United States and the laws that come from those institutions or whatever are at their core racist. Therefore, everything that comes out of those is going to be geared against the black person in favor of the white person.
And this is what the white man does to further dominance politically and economically.
This is, in a sense, the man keeping you down.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This is the man keeping you down. And it is inbred in the white man to make sure that laws are done this way.
To this day, even.
To this day. So the advocates of CRT are going to be like, that's the real problem. Now, again, we could unpack that on a lot of different layers, but I'm just going to throw this out and just for people to fall off their chair. Okay, at the highest level of making laws, we had a black president. I'm just going to leave it at that. All right? So what did that do to undo CRT if this is actually a reality? I'm going to leave that there. All right, I'll probably get some emails on that. All right, so intersectionality is kind of a new term that's kind of out there. I don't know how new it is, but it's kind of within the last, 5-7 years that I've heard it. Intersectionality. Okay, so we talk about races, we talk about your ethnic group. So in my case, there are these different sociological, cultural things that intersect. So I'm an interracial guy. All right, that's one strike against me. Okay? Because I'm
that's one intersection that you cross.
That's one intersection I cross. The other intersection I cross, I'm raised in the urban context. Okay, there's another one. You're in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, right? There's another one, right? The not fitting in with blacks or whites because you're interracial or you're a mulatto, right? There's dynamics to that. That could be another intersection. So you get all these intersections. And so intersectionality is saying you need to look at people and not just say, well, this guy is deprived because he is a minority. Wait a minute, hold on. He's a minority, and you know what the world did to minorities. Oh, and he's gay, and you know how the world is bashing gays. Oh, and he's married to another gay guy. That's a third intersectionality. Okay, and he lives in a poverty-stricken neighborhood. So now we got 4 intersectionalities, and you see what's happening.
So what is the goal of this then? To say, okay, this person who has been oppressed at all
these levels, yep,
now move him to the front of the line. Is that the end goal?
Well, the end goal is that there needs to be restoration. There needs to be there needs to be a recognition that, wow, it's not just that this guy is minority, but he's being hit at all these levels. So all these levels need to be dealt with, right? And yeah, to bring him at least on par with everybody else, because he has all these strikes against him, and each one needs to be acknowledged. Wow.
What is the danger of intersectionality, would you say?
Well, I think one of the dangers is, where is ownership on the individual, right? This, in other words, this is saying
it creates victims.
There's going to be there's going to be a victimization here,
and I don't want to diminish. There are victims in our culture.
There are
injustice, without question.
Absolutely. But it can create, hey, I don't have this happening because of this. Oh, I don't have this happening because of this, right? So it can create that. Biblically speaking, though, all of these things, if other people are oppressing other people on all these different levels, biblically speaking, God is not for any of that.
Yep.
Number one. So there's no, but the issue is, like, what do you do with it? What do you do with the guy who is a minority? He lives in poverty. He's a homosexual. He's also addicted to drugs. I mean, he has all these different. Okay, so I think the Bible speaks to all of those not as he's a victim, but what things does he need to do in his life? Choices, heart changes he needs to make within all of those intersections, as opposed to, here's all the places I intersect, what are you going to do for me? And so that,
yeah, because you could even go forward so far as to say, and I can start to hear this in the Christian community a little bit. Oh, well, Christianity is beginning to be marginalized. So, well, yeah, Jesus kind of said you would be.
Absolutely.
Now we've had the privilege of living in a country that's been very Christianized, where being a Christian has almost been celebrated over the years, or if you weren't a Christian, that wasn't normal, even, especially down south in certain parts of the country, right?
Yeah.
That's completely changed.
Right,
And now
right.
Christianity is more and more marginalized, kind of the way Jesus said, this will happen to you if you follow me. And so you can even drift into that as a Christian, say, oh, well, because I'm a Christian now, that's another intersection where I'm marginalized, and I can almost become a victim of the culture marginalizing me because I'm a... So I say that only to say we have to talk about, okay, what does the Bible talk about Christians that are marginalized? Or when you're marginalized because of your skin color, or when you're marginalized because of whatever.
Yep.
As a Christian, and this is where we have to go with this conversation.
Right.
All right? As a child of God, how do you view yourself? How do you respond to that?
Yeah.
And because these things are real, right? Like
Absolutely.
And so, but as a theory, or as a philosophy, I guess what we want to bring out is the fact that these are philosophies that govern a lot of what you're hearing, in the race war culture that we live in right now.
Yeah.
And so when you hear people saying things that doesn't quite hit you quite right, or what's he saying, you got to understand that a lot of times there's a bigger philosophy driving what's being communicated.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to understand that there's a real philosopher, whether it's critical race theory or whether he's talking from a perspective of intersectionality, stuff that doesn't quite hit you quite right. There's a reason for that, because there's an underlying worldview and an underlying philosophy that's driving what's being said. And so we need to be wise as Christians, right? And that's part of the reason we want to have these conversations on this podcast, is because we want to inform, we want to kind of untie the knots of confusion and provide some clarity, but then we want to say, how can we be wise? Because what I see with a lot of white Christian Americans is, who doesn't want justice, right? Of course, Black Lives Matter, right? And so even with these protests, there tends to be just a kind of a carte blanche. Yeah, I guess I need to start marching. I need to start protesting because I don't want to be a racist, and I don't want. I want to march with you, and I want to stand with you, and I want to. Yeah, you've been oppressed or whatever. And so there's this almost just this. I'm not going to say blind, but in some areas it's a blind following of a movement in our culture. That is birthed out of from maybe a white Christian. Yeah, I want to do what's right. Like I want to. Like who doesn't want justice, right?
Right.
And so I think next week we need to start to go there and start to talk about that. I also want to talk about and launch into a conversation about how does the white church connect with the black community? Is that possible?
Right.
Is it possible in the culture that we live in? And obviously, I would hope the answer to that is yes. But how do we do that? Right? What are some of the barriers that we can tear down in order for that to happen? And because you see white church, you see black churches, Chinese churches, right? Like, is that okay? Is that the way it should be? Right? The black church worship over here, the white people worship over here, the Chinese church over here, the Hispanic church over here, and that's kind of what we have in our American culture. And is that okay? If not, why?
And on that point, real quick, man, and we need to have a conversation on that because, is there a place in Scripture where God mandates that churches should be of the same ethnic group or should be blended? Right? So
because there's a big push in the North American church for multicultural.
That's the buzzword now, right?
If you're not multicultural, then somehow
something's wrong with you, right?
Or there's racism or something like that.
Right.
So
how do you I think it was Lifeway is a big Bible resource.
Through the Southern Baptist Convention.
They just put out a new things, and I forget the terminology, but it has to do with diversity and how to deal with the racial divide in your. And I'm like, you doing a Bible study on that? Really? If I live in a predominantly white community and the church is predominantly white, does that mean that church isn't woke?
Right.
Because there's no blacks and you got 1.2% minorities that live in the community. Now, if those 1.2% minorities that live in the community aren't welcome there, we got a biblical issue.
There you go.
If they're not coming there because it's like, this is not my culture, I can't.
Does the church reflect the culture that's around you ethnically?
Right.
If it's a multicultural
that's
culture.
A conversation we need to have, man, because there's a movement in evangelicalism that I personally don't agree with. Where and here's the thing, and then I'll shut up because I know we're out of time. It's targeted it at white churches. White churches, you need to get in your pulpit, number one, apologize for your whiteness and apologize for the sins of your forefathers. And I'm sitting there like, okay, chapter and verse me on that. Where's that in Scripture?
It's true. There is pressure, even with the George Floyd. Well, if you don't say something, then
you're guilty.
Part of the problem.
Right.
And I've wrestled with that.
Right.
And so there's this tension. I don't want to put my head in the sand.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I want to speak for what's true and right. But also we have to wrestle with my platform as a pastor and elder is not social change. We have to talk about the tension between that and my role as a minister of the gospel, a proclaimer of the gospel.
Right.
And so, but I do think that this issue will be one of the main issues that divides the North American church.
I agree.
It already is.
I agree. I totally agree.
And so how do we keep, and my heartbeat is how do we keep our local churches unified around all of this?
The scary part for me, Doug, is this. What I'm hearing in a nutshell is the way for the white church to do its part is to go after racial reconciliation. And to me, that's scary. Because what brings unity among diversity is the gospel of Jesus Christ, not race. And to me, this is a sleight of hand, an undermining of the gospel of Jesus Christ, where there's neither Jew but now churches are being pumped. It's about racial reconciliation. No, it's about being reconciled to God. We are ministers of reconciliation to a holy God. And if I get this right, then this will be right. So that might be 2 or 3 podcasts.
So we got a lot to cover, and we're gonna step into it. So on that note, we will wrap things up for today, and we will see you again next week as we continue our discussion.
All right.